We'll start. So, if we want to understand anything at all about violence in the Middle East, U.S. involvement in wars, we have to understand the history of the oil business. It's simply not possible to make any sense out of any of it without knowing this piece. So far, we started off by saying, well, okay, what do we know so far? Well, we know what crude oil is. It's this complex hydrocarbon, varying kinds of chemical composition, buried in very special traps laid down geologically a very long time ago. It has to be discovered, it has to be pumped out, transported to refineries, cooked in refineries, transported to marketing facilities, and then finally goes into the hands of ultimate consumers. We know that for crude oil production, once you find it, the costs of producing it, the variable costs are small. This is critical, as we will see later today. For refineries, basically think of them as gigantic stills or giant kitchens that are designed to heat these hydrocarbons, and then this heat affects various changes in the chemical composition. These various additives are put in order to create the final products that we need. Transporting this stuff, whether from crude to refinery or refined products from refinery to marketing, goes in two ways. Crude in particular moves largely in pipelines or oil tankers, and in short distances, especially final products, move in pumps. So what? Well, if we look at both pipelines and oil tankers, we know that one thing that is of concern to a lot of folks is that there are various choke points geographically. Given the concentrated location of this stuff, then to move it to final consumers, it has to be moved long distances. This then runs into various geographical choke points, some of which have played a big history. One of them in particular, the Suez Canal, a big history in the history of oil prices, and the Strait of Hormuz continues to play a big role. Pipelines are also a big deal, and there is quite a kind of sort of almost underground literature about pipelines and about the role of pipelines in planning for pipelines, their involvement with various forms of government and corporate corruption, various ways that you get people to build these, and the location of pipelines being something that nations are in contestation about. It's also true that pipelines, because they are so long, are relatively easy to blow up. And so they also become a set of targets. If we think about oil producers, we also saw, well, where is the oil and who produces it? There's a simple schematic that we saw of the different countries and the blue countries, where they came from, what OPEC is, how it was formed, and why it matters. We'll talk about in much more detail today. We also know that oil production is not just concentrated geographically from a geological standpoint, but also from a political economy standpoint. As we saw right here, where you scale countries by the size of their estimated reserves, here you have the Persian Gulf, and these 5 countries, Iran, Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and throw in a 6th, Qatar, and you had something like 2/3 or more of all the world's oil reserves. So not very surprising that this is a big deal. There are various estimates of where these reserves are distributed, but we also saw that this very concept, of how much oil is in the ground, the concept of reserves, is itself contested. That makes sense. It makes sense in the first place because of geological uncertainty. There is uncertainty about how much is there, and even more, how much once you know that a field is there, if that field has been in production for some time, how much of it can you ultimately get out? It's called ultimate recovery. How much of the oil that you think is there can you actually get out? There are also political and economic reasons for distorting reserves. For the private sector, we saw that reserves are, of course, a corporate asset. And your stock price is in part a function of those assets. So if your reserves suddenly fall, your stock price also falls, which is what happened to Shell in 2005. Countries in OPEC also have an incentive to distort reserves. As we saw, there was this very suspicious rise of reserves by Middle Eastern OPEC countries, which is most plausibly explained not by sudden geological discovery, but instead by issues about how OPEC quotas were negotiated internally. Last thing we looked at is this hypothesis of peak oil. What is it? Where does it come from? It comes from this man, M. King Hubbert, studying U.S. oil production, working for one of the major oil companies, and basically had this idea that peak of production follows discovery with a lag, and typically when about half of the oil had been used up, then there would be a fairly rapid decline in production. This has been applied to talking about the United States, where the green bars show discovery, then there's a lag, there's a peak, and then it falls off. And this is indeed something more or less what has happened to production in the U.S. Whether, as we saw last time, you talk about the lower 48 only, as this graph shows, or even if you include Alaska. There was another graph that I didn't reproduce here. It shows a further decline. So then, peak oil advocates generalize this argument to the world. Now, why would they do that? They would say, well, as we'll see today, the United States is where first oil production began. It is second the place that has had the most sustained and systematic exploration for oil of any place in the world. And third, it has had production sustained for the longest period. And consequently, the rest of the world, they believe, is likely to look like the experience of the United States, only with something of a lag. So this was the peak oil perspective. It says here's discovery, the purple bars. And notice where the discovery is at a peak here. It's at a peak in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and then it falls off. Meanwhile, demand continues its merry way upwards, and so they are basically making the argument that the world is likely to look very much like the United States. Not everybody agrees with this. There are plenty of people who think this is not true, who think that this is too simple, and although there are a variety of counter-arguments that are given in rebuttal of peak oil, possibly the most cogent is the one that says, really, it may be that what mostly is going on here is a lack of investment. That there simply hasn't been the kind of investment, and this may be due largely to things like economic incentives and political structures. Now, we also saw finally that just because geologically speaking the peak oil hypothesis may be false, this doesn't mean that it doesn't matter for global events. Because if major political figures believe something like peak oil, or even if they believe that this explains the world, and they think then we've got to find a way to increase this investment, and we think that the barrier to that investment comes from political and economic structures, then maybe what we do is change those structures by force. This is one hypothesis about the link between oil and war. Very simple, probably too simple, but it's worth thinking about, and we'll come back. Okay, so what do we know so far about the economics of oil? One can make no sense at all out of the oil business without studying its economics. We know that the demand for oil is a derived demand. We know that demand is relatively inelastic. We'll see today that supply is also. And we know that there is a critical role for conservation incentives, and we know that it is a business, because of the critical role of investment on both the demand and the supply sides, that is characterized by considerable leads and lags. This, by itself, structurally, is a recipe for price instability. Now, today, we need to go on and talk about some other concepts. We're going to talk about economic rent. We're going to talk about conflict over property rights, the formation and erosion of cartels, the industrial structure, what's called the IO, the industrial organization by economists. What's the structure of the oil industry? Is it a competitive industry? Is it a monopoly? Is it an oligopoly? What is it? There are these different categories in economics. There's a special category called oligopoly with a competitive fringe, which is probably the best description of the industrial organization of the oil business. And we have to do political economy, because as we will see from the very beginning, nation states play a critical role in the international and indeed the national oil business. And the last thing we have to talk about is that the price of oil is an asset price. That is to say, oil is an asset. What's an asset in economics? An asset is something that gives value or utility over time, like a house is an asset. Indeed, for most Americans, their principal asset is their home, if they own one. And what does that mean? What determines the price of an asset? Prices of assets, any asset, whether it's a stock, a house, a factory, a building, or oil in the ground, any asset's price is determined ultimately by what people think it will be worth in the future. This means that in a world of highly organized commodity and financial markets, there is inevitably a major speculative component in the price of oil, and we will see in spades, if not today, then early in the lecture on Tuesday, how that played a role in the most recent escalation of oil prices that happened a year and a half ago. All right, so these are the things we need to talk about. Okay, economic rent. Nothing about the oil business is as important as this concept. It is absolutely critical. The concept of economic rent, roughly speaking, is the difference between your cost of production and the cost of production of the producer with the highest cost. The picture there is the picture of the famous political economist David Ricardo, who wrote in the early 19th century in England and who developed this idea talking about land. That the rent of land of high quality was ultimately determined by final demand that went out to the last and least valuable kind of land. Okay? Why does this make sense? It makes sense because if there are different costs of production, either of what you're supplying or of close substitutes to what you're supplying, and then there's only so much that can be produced very cheaply, and you keep going out and out and demand keeps going up, clearly the price you pay to the marginal producer has got to cover that marginal producer's costs. But if his costs are up here and your costs are down there, then the price is way up here, your costs are down here, and everything in between is pure gravy. It's just rent. Economic rent. Notice, economic rent is not the same as the rent you pay when you rent an apartment. This is a specific economic concept. So the other way to put it is that it's the difference between your cost of production and the market price. We could call this in the oil business Ricardian rent, and the rents in the oil business have been always, and today even more so, absolutely enormous. And why do we care about this? We care about this because this creates an enormous incentive to get your hands on this stuff. This stuff is unbelievably valuable. The rents are gigantic, and countries, nations, and companies are very eager to get their hands on.
So is economic rent kind of the same thing as profit?
For most, certainly, in the short run, yes. For econ students, the difference is simply is fixed costs. If you abstract from fixed costs, it's the same thing. Okay? it's not really legitimate to so abstract unless the fixed costs are relatively small. They're not in the oil business. But in effect, think of it as the equivalent of profits. Okay? Let's look at a supply function for crude oil. What are we talking about here? What's a supply function? It talks about the quantity supplied as a function of price. But ultimately, of course, it's the quantity supplied as a function of cost. Why? Because unless the price covers your cost, you're not going to produce it. So what are we talking about here? This is a somewhat dated graph, but only somewhat. Here's Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, and Iraq. How much does it cost them to produce a barrel of oil? Answer, on this graph, $1. Today, maybe $1.50 to $2 to produce a barrel of oil. The price of oil today, this morning, was $71.35. So you can see the rents are big. Well, what about the United Arab Emirates? Well, it costs a little more. Mexico and the rest. So you see that here's the quantity, and they supply this much, and then a little more is supplied, and so it jumps up. Keeps jumping up, keeps jumping up. Here's the U.S. in the lower 48. It's more expensive to produce it. Maybe $6 a barrel to produce oil in West Texas, Southern California, along the Gulf Coast, and so on. But notice, even when you get to oil wells that are, pretty difficult. Stripper wells mean that you're trying to get the last little drop out of already existing wells. You're still talking $12, call it $15 a barrel. Here's a supply function using the same idea of costs for the world. It looks something like this. Remember, the consumption these days is around what? Is around something like 90 million barrels a day. And this is in millions of barrels a day. And what have we got? We've got this stair-step production function going out like this. Another idea. 80% of new capacity installed in the oil business, costs of production are about $8 a barrel. Again, contrast that with the current price. We are talking very large rents. And OPEC and the Persian Gulf within OPEC has the lowest costs of production in the world, which means they have the largest rents in the world. Now that provides an incentive to try to get your hands on it, now doesn't it? Here's what the geometry looks like. If you've got one of these stair-step production functions like this, and here's, let's say, the price out here, well, then everything in between is the pure gravy that you get, the difference between the price and your costs. So what does this mean? It means this. It means that the vast majority of oil revenue is rent, not something that you have to get in order to cover your costs of production. Here's what it was this morning. This morning, according to the New York Times, I think it was something like $73 a barrel, maybe it was $71.50, I don't remember exactly, but it's in this ballpark figure. A couple of days ago, it was $78. It fluctuates. But if the cost of production in the Persian Gulf is between $1.50 and $2, and that's a generous, it's kind of a high estimate of their cost of production, and it is an estimate of costs that includes capital costs, their rents per barrel are very large indeed. So this is a hugely valuable asset, which means that a useful way to think about the history of the oil business is of a vast contest and struggle over rents. How to get your hands on all this money. How to get your hands on this enormously valuable rent. Now, ultimately, what constrains rents? Well, two things constrain rent. One is final demand. And that, as we know, has to do with the derived demand concept, which in turn means what other technologies are available for us to get what it is we want. One way to think about this is at what price of more expensive technologies to produce the cold beer and hot showers that we ultimately want become competitive. Sometimes this is called the rent ceiling. Notice, technological change, not in the oil business, but in automobiles, in electricity generation. All of these things can drive down the ceiling for rents. This is an important potential area for public policy. But for some uses, like plastics and jet fuel, we have no idea how to develop really much of a substitute for it. We can use them less, but other than just doing it less, there aren't any obvious differences. So, the rents are huge. Given then what we know about the structure of production, the different stages of production, its geographical concentration, and these huge rents, we need to start developing some concepts that talk about what I'm going to call the struggle for cash and control. This is a struggle over rents. Yes, but
would it be possible to kill that front row of lights?
That's a good question. Let's see. Probably it is. Does that help? This is fundamentally a conflict over property rights. Now, conventional economics typically doesn't talk about this very much. Property rights are typically taken as given already. There is sort of subfields that talk about contests over this, but they're relatively minor. This won't do in talking about the oil business. We have to talk about conflicts over property rights, and therefore we have to know what is a property right in the first place. A property right is most usefully thought of as some socially sanctioned right to residual income and residual control. What does this mean? Let's say you own a car. What does it mean to say you own your car? It means that after everything else is paid off, if you're using this to drive people around for pay, like a taxi cab, you get the money. You don't get all the money. You don't get all the revenue, right? Because you have to pay off, let's say, the car loan, and you have to pay for the cost of operation. So it's the residual that's left over to you. That's what a property right defines in terms of income. It also defines the residual control, decision-making power. There are rules about how you can use this stuff. And for an ordinary citizen or a company operating inside of national boundaries, those rules are pretty well specified in terms of the legal system. But remember, the international oil business, we are talking about the anarchic world of the international state system, where there is no ultimate government. There is no final arbiter of much of anything. And consequently, there is a great deal of conflict over who gets decision-making. And one hypothesis about what has been going on in the Middle East in the last decade or so is precisely an attempt by the United States government to overturn certain outcomes of the struggle over control and also cash that happened in the 1970s. That it's a kind of attempt to go back, turn the clock back to the way the world worked in the international oil business in the 1950s and 60s. This is another hypothesis about the link between blood and oil. So this conflict over property rights is a struggle over cash and control. Who are the big players? It's a complex conflict between governments, rich governments up in the top, oil companies, which are huge multinational organizations, and the countries, sovereign states, that comprise something called the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Now, it could be more general. We could talk about sovereign states of oil-producing countries, not just OPEC, but others. Sovereign states of consuming countries, oil companies. But you could talk about, but this is a useful way to think about it. Now, remember, we're talking about a very expensive business. Massive investment required for exploration and discovery, not so much for production, but once it's installed, but refining, distribution, marketing, pipelines, tankers, all of this stuff is massively expensive. There's a great deal of money involved in this business. This has a number of really important consequences. Now, who are these players more specifically? First, private oil companies. Now, in a critical historical period that we have to understand that has gone by One reason we want to understand it is that a great deal of Middle Eastern history took place during this period, and a lot of very bad blood between Western governments and companies and those nation states was generated in this period. And also because there is this hypothesis out there that one way to understand what's been going on now is an attempt to turn the clock back to that period. We need to understand who the players were in this period of 1945 to 1975, this particular generation of the immediate post-war period. These companies, as we'll see, will be usefully divided into so-called majors and independents. Think very big companies, the majors. Very big companies, there's specifically a list of 7 to 8 of them, and we'll talk about them in detail later, who acted as if they were a cartel. They tried to establish a kind of oligopoly position in the market, and as we will see, they were highly successful in doing this. And as we will also see, for good, straightforward, economic, analytical reasons, their cartel was eroded. And one of the forces that eroded is this second bullet point, the independent oil companies. Smaller oil companies, still very large relative to many companies, but small relative to the major oil companies. And that these independents, trying to get their hands on some of the rents, entered the game and helped do 2 things. 1, erode the share of the majors, and 2, help strengthen the hand of the countries. We're going to talk about, so we'll need to talk about that. Governments, like governments in the European Union or the government of Japan, and especially the government of the United States, those choices will also play a huge role in determining what happens, and last but hardly least, the governments of the major producing countries. What are the consequences of this? Of all of this stuff about the basic economic structure of the oil business. By now, you can see there are substantial economies of scale. Simple economics tells us that when that is true, large firms tend to be favored. But this is not equally true at all stages of production. The risks are also very large. In itself, according to some calculations, a potential source of size. There are lots of leads and lots of lags. You add inelastic supply and demand, and you get price instability. Now, how big are these oil companies? How large do they loom in the political economy of the United States? This is a list of the largest publicly traded companies in the Fortune 500 index a few years ago. What do we find? We find the biggest one is ExxonMobil, there's Walmart, Royal Dutch Shell, British Petroleum, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips. That is 5 of the biggest 10 corporations in the United States. 5, half of them are oil companies. Suppose you throw in automobiles, which after all are closely linked. How big is the auto industrial complex? Answer, 9 of the top 10. Only Walmart is the only non-oil, either producing or directly using industry that you find. What are the rest of these? Okay? If you take the top 20, 6 of them are oil companies, 5 are auto companies, then there's Walmart and General Electric, and the rest are financial companies. So, enough said. If your theory of the state has to do with lobbying power, and that's a useful notion about how states operate, but many of us think it's too simple a notion of how states operate, but it's a useful building block. And as a building block, there is no doubt that these companies are very, very large. So, let's talk about market structure. I've said that this is, the idea is oligopoly with competitive fringe. What does this mean? It's pretty simple, actually. It sounds intimidating, but it isn't really. We can't call it a monopoly because monopoly, by definition, means one seller. And there isn't just one seller in the oil business. Indeed, this has never been the case. There has never been a monopoly on oil production. There's been something close in the early years under Standard Oil under John D. Rockefeller, but even he didn't establish a complete monopoly. Instead, what you have is typically one or a set of companies or countries that dominate the market. What do I mean by dominate? I mean that they and they alone do not take the price as given. Econ students will remember that that's one of the definitions of a competitive firm. A competitive firm, by definition, takes the price in the market as given. Why? Because the competitive firm's decisions on output will not affect the price. Why? How does that make sense? Because their output relative to the size of total output is small. So it is reasonable for them to take the price as given. That's what defines a competitive firm in economics, and that's what defines, therefore, the competitive fringe in the oil business. But then there are a set of players, or a player, it depends on the particular time period, that is the oligopolist, the big guy. And the big one does worry about the consequences of their choice of output and the implications that has for the final price. So in effect, the oligopolist makes some calculations, knowing, of course, that there is this competitive fringe out there. Makes calculations about, okay, how much are we going to produce this year, this week, this month, over 2 years, over 5 years, typically not that long. We make a kind of a decision, and then we know that the other folks that'll have an impact on price, we hope, and then other people will take advantage of this. This is the competitive fringe will act. This is the way to think about the economic organization, the industrial organization, to put it in formal economic terms, of the oil business. And we'll see how this plays out over and over and over again in the history of the oil business, the way the oligopolists make a move, and then the competitors react. Now, there's a peculiar feature here. Oligopoly with competitive fringe exists in other industries. But in this industry, after 1973-4, the oligopoly is not composed of private companies. The oligopoly is composed of sovereign states, which means immediately all that stuff we studied in the first half of the first chunk of the course about state systems, the nature of the state, nationalism, all of that stuff immediately becomes relevant, which is one of the reasons we did all that. Because you can't make any sense out of even the basic economics of the oil business without having some understanding of this. It is also the case that in the economic world, everybody always wants to be a monopolist. Right? Adam Smith recognized this in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations. Every single business person, he said, seeks to become a monopolist. But wishes are not the same as reality. And in fact, there is constant struggle, and indeed, one useful handle on the history of the oil business is to see it as a series, as a process where cartels are formed and then erode. And they are reformed and then they erode. And reformed and erode, and this is useful. Why do they erode? Two kinds of reasons. Any cartel faces two problems, called in economics the internal problem and the external problem. We're going to need to talk about that. And last but not least, we need to talk about some of the costs of being the oligopolist. One of the costs of being the big player, one of the costs of thinking that your output decisions will affect the price, is that if you want the price to stay up, typically the only way to do this is to cut back on your own production, which means you forego some rents. Now, maybe you calculate that's worth it to you, but there is a price to be paid for this. This means that, in effect, there is something called a swing producer. A producer that will react to these changes in the market, and if that swing producer is attempting to hold up the price, then it will react in a certain kind of way. Here's a simple graphic that shows what is the industrial structure. You've got the big one in the middle and the little ones around the edges. Okay? So, the history of the oil business is also the rise, consolidation, and erosion of the relative strength of the cartel in comparison with these competitive firms. So we've got relative strength of the cartel itself relative to these outsiders, are rising and falling. There are basically 4 cartels in the history of the oil business we need to talk about. The first is before World War I. Second, a bunch of attempts, the so-called Red Line Agreement, Akhnakari, I'll talk about that in a minute, ways in which there were these attempts to create cartel in the interwar period. The cartel of the so-called Seven Sisters, a term that came from the Italian oil minister of the time, Enrico Mattei. It was not a compliment. He did not like them. This cartel was hugely successful. And then last but hardly least for our purposes, the cartel of sovereign states. Notice that the first 3 cartels are cartels of privately owned companies, publicly traded typically, but they're private companies, they're corporations. The last cartel is a cartel of sovereign states. So we have really 2 dynamics going on. One is the erosion, the consolidation and erosion of a cartel itself. That happens 4 times. But the second is this fundamental shift from cartels, stronger or weaker depending on circumstances, of private companies, and that shift to a cartel of sovereign states, namely OPEC. So what's the problem with cartels? Let's just review basic econ of this. Let's look at the internal cartel problem. Well, this is pretty straightforward. You're familiar with the prisoner's dilemma game, and that's what goes on. Okay? The problem in this kind of situation is that if we did try to maintain a price, let's say we try to jack up the price, and we try, how do we do this? There's only one way to do that, and that's to produce less. If I produce, then we have to have an agreement. Let's say there are 2 of us, and so we do a deal. And we do this deal of restricting the total amount that we produce. But the best possible deal for you is if I take my oil off the market and you cheat. Then you get the benefit not only of the high price, but of the additional volume that you get to sell. And you do, and I try to do the same thing to you. And as we do both, then the whole thing collapses. Basic prisoner's dilemma game. What's the key to dealing with this? The key to changing the structure of the game internally so that it is not a prisoner's dilemma game is to detect cheating. You need to know that people are cheating on you. And then you need to be able to stop it if you find out that it's happening. You need to be able to detect it, and you need to be able to deter it. And it's very instructive to compare the difference between the private company cartel's ability to do this and the national cartel of OPEC. So there's a difference in how they did it. This slide, for those of you who need review, that's the basic payoff matrix of a prisoner's dilemma game. If you don't know about this, go review it. And there's basically notion that what happens is that cooperation of both is in the interests of both. Those are the highest payoffs for both A and B. But since there's this danger of if I cooperate and you cheat, and I'm A, I get screwed. And if you cooperate and I cheat, you lose. And we both know this, so we both cheat to avoid this nasty outcome, and we wind up here, which is not as good as what would have happened if we both cooperate. Basic structure of a prisoner's dilemma game. So, how do you manage this internal cartel problem? Formally speaking, another way to say this is, how do you ensure that how do you try to undo the prisoner's dilemma structure? How do you try to do something such that this isn't what goes on? Well, there were 3 different mechanisms. One is long-term contracts. Okay? This was a way of doing things that characterized the heyday of the 3rd private cartel between 1945 and 1975. Long-term contracts. There were some companies that were so-called crude short. What are we talking about? Remember the stages of production of the oil business. Let's say you're a large, vertically integrated company. So you operate at all of those stages. You are engaged in exploration and discovery, and you have oil wells. You also have refineries, and you have a whole network of distribution systems. Right? Maybe you have more crude oil than you you have refining and marketing capacity? If so, you were called crude long. You had more of that. On the other hand, suppose you had more refining and marketing capacity than you had crude oil production. That meant you were crude short. Next, imagine that different members of the cartel are different. Some are crude long, some are crude short. So, if these guys then have contracts for 10 and 20 years, that means they're operating together. They have contracts which are enforceable in courts of law. It undoes, to a certain extent, the prisoner's dilemma structure, because you now know what the other side is doing, and they're committed to making certain kinds of decisions, and so you jointly decide on the level of production. Long-term contracts is one mechanism. Second mechanism that these private firms used, and we're going to go over this in more detail when we run the movie. The movie will start fairly soon. Okay? Joint ventures. This was a network, particularly in the richest part of the world from an oil perspective, the Persian Gulf, where all of the different companies owned shares of a kind of joint venture company that operated in a specific country. That meant that they were together in the boardrooms. Their accountants sat down together. They knew how much, and once again, it is this kind of exchange of information that helps to undo the internal cartel problem. Now, OPEC does neither of these things, although long-term contracts are just beginning to make a comeback, not between OPEC countries and companies, but between OPEC countries and the national oil companies of various consuming countries like China or Russia or Indian companies. There are ways in which this is making something of a comeback, but it's not nearly as important yet as it used to be. OPEC tries to do it with production quotas. Remember, it's harder to maintain a cartel of sovereign states because at the end of the day, remember, it's an anarchic world in international relations. And a sovereign state is a sovereign state, and nobody tells them what to do unless it's really, and you can make it in their own interest. So they have production quotas. And typically, there is a role of a swing producer. There's a kind of enforcer, and we will see that in terms of understanding who's the enforcer in OPEC, the answer is very clear. The enforcer in OPEC is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And this, in turn, is critical for making sense out of the history of the oil business and the way it plays in political economy. Here's what these joint ventures look like. This is a chart taken from some hearings held in the Senate in the 1950s about monopoly power in the oil business. We used to hold hearings about these kinds of things back in the old days. We gave that up, and the Supreme Court has guaranteed that we will never see this again. Anyway, never mind. So here you have things like, take one of these. Here's Aramco. That's the Arabian American Oil Company. That's the sole company that operated in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The Saudi government dealt with this company. But what was this company? Notice the little arrows. It was a composite company composed of Mobil Oil Company, Texaco, Exxon, Standard Oil of California. And each one of these national companies was similar. The one in Abu Dhabi, the one in Kuwait, the one in Iran, the one in Iraq. All of them. All the big producers in the Persian Gulf. And so these major oil companies were all interconnected through this system of joint ventures. So a combination of joint ventures and long-term contracts between crude short and crude long companies helped them to overcome the internal cartel problem. Okay? We've already talked about this. 20-year, it's good. Now, what about OPEC? First of all, there's its flag. What is it? It didn't exist before 1960. It formed in 1960, and we want to know why. What caused it to come into existence? We'll talk about this. It played a kind of small-scale role in the 1960s, but then it becomes increasingly, together with its components, largely driven by its components of the national governments, major players in the struggle over property rights, over rents and decision making. And the bottom line here is we want to trace this struggle. And the struggle ends. It ends in 1974. In the winter of 1974, really by 1973, the game is over. OPEC wins. They take over the entirety of the rents and the decision making. Okay? How did that happen? How did that come about? We want to talk about that. It's a cartel of sovereign states composed of these countries, although this map is a bit out of date. Indonesia, whose oil production is declining, has since withdrawn. Notice one feature. Concentrated in the Persian Gulf, but also two other Middle Eastern states, Libya and Algeria, who we will see play important supporting roles in the drama of the shift in property rights away from major oil companies towards the oil-producing countries, and, hardly least, Venezuela. Venezuela has always been a major player in OPEC. From the beginning, they were part of why OPEC was formed, and they remain to today. What about these swing producers? Somebody, if you're going to offer monopoly power, then you're trying to use some market power, I should say. If you're going to exercise some market power, somebody's got to vary their production. Until recently, the Saudis could do this, but now that's tricky, right? Because you can lose market share. But here's one thing to remember. When people talk about who controls the oil business, by now you should know that that is the kind of question that is actually meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. Nobody controls. What do you mean, control? Do you mean control final consumers? There are billions of them. What are we talking about? Do we mean controls the technology that governs derived demand? Again, well, what are we talking about? That doesn't make any sense. Are we talking about the supply of oil? Again, what exactly do we mean? We now know that really it's supplied by an industrial structure of this complicated sort of an oligopoly with a competitive fringe. So what does that mean? Do the competitors control the supply? Well, that doesn't really make any sense. What about the oligopolists? Do they control? Well, they may have some short-run market power over price. That you can say. The only way in which discussions about control of oil mean anything is short-run market power. Why short-run? Because in the long run, if you drive the price of oil through the roof, you're likely to get responses on the side of final demand. You're likely to get not just an internal cartel problem, which you may get, but you're also going to get an external cartel problem. So you need a swing producer, but even they have limits, because if OPEC tries to hold up the price as they did in this period, they can only do this by losing market share. That was true of OPEC as a whole, and within OPEC, most of the burden was borne by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Here's what the Saudis did, and we will see that this is one of the forces that leads to the third oil shock. First oil shock will be in 1973-4. Second oil shock will be in 1978-9. Third oil shock, going the other way, price collapse, not price explosion, will be in 1986. Fourth oil shock will be what happened most recently, going up and coming down. Right? And we want to talk about all of this to make sense. And here's what's happened to Saudi Arabia. Their share fell, and then, as we will see, they got tired of this. Now, this is an excellent example of conjuncture. There were many things going on. Good example of the concept of overdetermination. The Saudis had a number of different reasons for changing their behavior, any one of which would likely have been sufficient to get them to change, and they did, and they recovered their market share, and it's been like this. Now, there's a debate about whether or not OPEC can continue to do this, to play this role of, well, if you want to hold up the price, you've got to cut back your production. If you're worried about the price getting too high, you increase your production. So, you have to be able to vary your production capacity, which is where debates on peak oil start mingling with discussions of price. Because if you think some of these countries that have been producing oil for 2 generations, or maybe 3, or maybe 4, as in the case of Iran, maybe they're running out of this stuff and maybe they no longer have the capacity to increase or decrease their production. And there is this notion, here's one view, that the excess capacity, which is a necessary condition for being able to act as a swing producer, in OPEC has been declining. This is one perspective. It says, well, okay, they used to be swing producers, but now they're constrained by supply. But you're not shocked to learn, now that you know that there's a big debate about peak oil, not everybody agrees with this. And what does this mean? It means, again, there's another way. You remember one of the things on peak oil was it's the critics of peak oil says, yeah, this is the boy crying wolf again. And we've heard this over and over again. There they go again, saying the sky is falling, Chicken Little, and then it doesn't. Okay? There's also been a series of sagacious pronouncements by pundits about OPEC is on the ropes, OPEC is about to fall apart, and again, it hasn't kind of worked out like that. So you want to be very cautious about these pronouncements that OPEC can no longer do it, because look here, this is what the Energy Information Agency thinks, they're getting this back. So understanding OPEC and this contest about how much market power OPEC will or will not have is going to be critical in understanding this. What about the external cartel problem? This is pretty simple. It has both a supply and demand component. The supply side is pretty straightforward. If you make something even more valuable than it was before, you increase the incentives of people with higher costs to enter the market. That's the basic supply. So you find new oil, it's discovered, and then it enters. But on the demand side, it's arguably even more important. Why even more important? Because, after all, on the supply side, do you really need a higher price of oil in order to create incentives for exploration and discovery when, even at relatively low prices, the rents are enormous? Do you really need it? Is it really important? Maybe. It's certainly a further incentive, but not too clear, right? But on the demand side, it's a very big deal. Because on the demand side, you get a direct use impact, fall in demand, even with existing technologies. But most importantly, higher prices can induce technological change and innovation. And as we've seen already, this happened in the United States in the 1980s. And then we backed off. We did it for a while, it affected certain industries, and then we gave it up. Right? But that's one. Cold beer and hot showers again. The ultimate cartel problem. This is an article from Business Week. That man is the oil minister of Saudi Arabia. And this is a direct quote. Okay? Big worry for a country that mainly makes its living by selling oil. They're worried about what they call permanent destruction of demand. What do they mean? Nasty little environmentalists who go around, buy something different, who find a different way to move around, to take a cold shower, to drink a hot beer. People who find different ways to do it. So again, notice how this derived demand, I keep hammering on this. There is really nothing from your perspective, both as a student of environmental economics and environmental studies, and as a citizen of the United States, there is nothing more important to this concept of derived demand. There are lots of things we could do here, and it matters. It matters a lot. Last point. It's an asset. Something valuable that lasts over time. Houses are a great example. What's your house worth? What your house is worth is a function of what everybody else thinks your house is worth. It's that simple. This is always true of assets. Something that's been known by financial economists since the beginning. John Maynard Keynes wrote eloquently about this 2 generations ago. It's pretty clear. So what other people think matters. That depends on people's forecasts of supply and demand. Depends on developments in other asset markets to which the market for your asset may be linked. In this case, financial markets, currency markets. And given that oil is concentrated, and given that that some of the major players are nation states, it depends on the politics. It depends on political stuff. We have both spot and future markets, and there's lots of speculation. Okay. So armed with these analytical pieces, let's watch a movie. What determines oil prices? Well, it's complicated. It makes sense. There are all these kinds of things that have to do with international politics, forces on the demand side, forces in commodity markets. It's a long and complicated picture. What we want to explain, this graph truncates the last shock, but we'll add that. We want to explain this graph. That's going to be complicated, right? You can see just by looking at this that no straightforward, simple answer will do about what determines oil prices. But the first thing you want to know, let me just highlight a few things. The initial period of any market tends to be highly unstable. Thanks, stuff is discovered, and we'll look at this. But first, look at this period from 1970 all the way back to here. Here's the end of World War II. Here's a whole generation later. Notice how stable the price is. How is this explained? This requires explanation. The explanation, though, will be straightforward. The cartel. The cartel was able to do this because it could overcome the internal problem through those two mechanisms, but it also was a period of erosion of its relative strength, and then something big clearly happens right here. In 1973-74, suddenly, there is this huge increase in the price. How did that happen? By the way, this is real prices, as it says. Right? This is controlled for inflation. So that's the first oil shock. How do we explain that? And then, how do we explain this? In percentage terms, it's smaller, but in absolute value, it's larger. Gigantic. What happens there? But then notice what happens next. Price explodes in two shocks, and then starts to come down, and then wham, falls down sharply here. How is this explained? And then it trends down lower. Now, if though we go to a graph that just shows more recent history, here's the long period of price stability, first shock, second shock, third shock, little spike for the first invasion of Iraq, and then up it goes. Yeah, question.
So, if they were able to control the price, why would it be relatively so low? If it's the cartel's ability to control that price, wouldn't they want it to be a lot higher?
That's a good question. The real answer is it's what's called in economics limit pricing. Here's the danger. If you jack the price up too high and you're smart, and you're taking a longer run view, you know that a high price is going to encourage entry of other players. So you want a stable price. You're happy to make money. If you push the price up too high, you're going to encourage lots of competitors. And you don't want that. So it's a long run view. It's called limit pricing. Okay? We didn't go into it because it's a little more complex analytically. But that's essentially what was going on with major oil.
So they're playing it safe to make their profits.
They're making plenty of money. Okay? Back in those days, the price of oil was around, in those days, using money of the time, the price of oil was around $1 or $1.50 a barrel. But in those days, because the dollar was worth so much less, the cost of production was less than a quarter. So they were still making very large rents, making a great deal of money. That's one reason. Second reason. Again, from a long-run perspective, not only do you have to worry about competitors coming in, but in that era in the United States, you had to worry about antitrust issues. And there are ways, as we'll see, that those issues were set aside by the United States for foreign policy reasons. Okay? The United States government, as we'll see, made a direct decision to let them do this. Okay? As a foreign policy decision. But there were issues, there were worries, concern about what Congress might do. So it's both limit pricing and also concern about what might happen. Then notice we get this little spike here, trends down. In this late 1990s era, I can tell you from personal experience that in Washington there was a lot of talk about how the oil price was down, and it would stay down, and this was going to ruin the countries in the Middle East, and the government of Iran was obviously doomed, and all this kind of stuff, and I kept saying, no, probably not. Yeah, once again, you've forgotten history, things change, they turn on a dime, and sure enough, things change, and up we go. But We reach a post-World War II high, actually, but it didn't stay that way, because it then crashed. It went up and it came down. Now, many people think that there are going to be two forces driving up the price. Some are developments on the real side of the market. Some of them are speculation. How did the speculation start? Well, if you have a big shooting war right on top of most of the oil in the world, this makes people nervous, and so this can drive up the price. And then if all of a sudden it becomes a speculative bubble, and bubbles always pop, and down we come, but then there's some kind of recovery. So this is the most recent shock in 2008, but then in 2009, prices recover from their low, and we're back here. So we have to talk about economic history. Why? That's where we get data. These processes are in their very core dynamic and historical. We need to look at this movie. We need to see these ways in which the cartel arises, all these multiple interactions, how these cartels arise. This is the stuff we've got to talk about, and there's this parallel struggle over property rights, decision-making. In this particular issue, the U.S. and the United Kingdom played a central role. Yes, it was private companies, but the U.S. and the U.K. governments also played a role, and this sows the seeds of lots and lots of conflict over this. It is potentially a source of thinking about oil wars. We have the U.S., and so let's talk about the history of the oil business. Okay. In talking about the history of the oil business, the place to start is we must distinguish between what happens in the United States and what happens everywhere else. Let's talk about this. Why do we need to do this? Because there are very different institutional structures and histories. Here's a simple piece of institutional structure. In the United States, subsoil mineral rights are typically owned by the person who owns the land that sits on top of the subsoil mineral rights. So when you drive down I-5 and you're down around Bakersfield and you see all those rigs pumping, or if you ever go to regions of Texas and you see them doing this, every single person who owns the land that that rig is on, that's what it is. They own the land, and therefore they own the stuff that's underneath it. The United States is the only country in the world where that is true. Everywhere else, subsoil mineral rights are not owned by the landowner. They're owned by the state. This is a huge difference. This means that all kinds of other things happen. All kinds of other stuff. It's not the case that Mexican landowners own the oil underneath it. The state of Mexico owns it. It's not even the case in Canada. There are all kinds of Canada's a little more like us. It's a little more complicated. But in the Middle East, in Venezuela, in Indonesia, in most of the rest of the world, governments, not private individuals, own the subsoil rights. So that makes a big difference. There are also ways in which, as we'll see, the United States made political decisions in Congress to isolate the U.S. market from the rest of the world. But there are lots of interactions simply because the United States has been the largest consumer of oil, so it's the biggest market, so access to the American market is really critical. So there's a lot of interaction between these markets, and we need to begin by talking about the U.S. Okay, so we need to talk about different production stages and the formation and erosion of cartels. So what's the early years? Highly competitive. Why? Because again, remember, once you find the stuff, which basically in those days, because the available technology for exploration was extremely crude by our modern standards, you basically had a kind of a hunch that you might have oil. Maybe you saw stuff seeping out of the ground. Maybe people down the road were producing. And so you would drill. Right? If you found it, we already know that then your costs of production were pretty low. So lots of people did this. And then there's this thing called the law of capture. Once you get it, it's yours. Right? So it doesn't seem very likely that if you wanted to create a monopoly doing it at this level would do much for you. And it didn't. And that's not how market power was established in the oil business, and that's not where the major oil companies that so dominate the Fortune 500 came from. They came from further downstream. Let's see how that worked. Refining and marketing were the choke points for establishing some kind of monopoly power. For instance, in this generation, Standard Oil, which at that time was one company, had about 85 to 90% of the American market. Formally speaking, not a monopoly, but pretty damn close. Right? Really close. The only time that has ever been true was in these early years, and they created this, and boy, did they make a lot of money. How did this happen? How was one company able to do this? In particular, how did one man do this? And that man was John D. Rockefeller, who was the founder of the industry, the founder of Standard Oil, which then has a bunch of successor companies. How did he do it? Starting up refining oil in Cleveland, Ohio, he built up one of the world's most successful companies. And one of his successors, Exxon, which then merged with Mobil, now called ExxonMobil. Before it was called Exxon. Before that it was called Standard Oil of New Jersey. Before that it was called Standard Oil. They go through these different names. Is even today the largest company in the United States. He's an icon of U.S. business practices and of cleverly creating monopoly power. How did he do this? Where's the source of market power of the Standard Oil? Not via large economies of scale, even in refining. Didn't do it that way. Instead, he did it by getting monopoly power in the railroad business, which in those days, because pipelines were some, but relatively small, most of the stuff moved by railroads, so he would merge with railroads, use a system of rebates and then predatory pricing, meaning that whatever his competitor would charge, he would charge below his own costs in order to drive the other firm out of business. He would force them out of business, or they could accept an offer. He would make them an offer they couldn't refuse in economic terms, and they would merge with him, and this way, and he maintained it via this limit pricing idea that I talked about. He would then do this and then have a price that was sufficiently high that he was getting monopoly rents, but low enough that it didn't induce lots of other people to enter. Here's a simple schematic of how Rockefeller did it. He buys up some competitors. This allows him to expand the volume that his company produces. He goes to the railroads and says, dudes, I'm a big producer. Give me a special deal. Give me a discount. And they would say, gosh, I guess we will, because it makes business sense. So he can charge lower prices. And as he does this, then he can bankrupt his competitors so he can buy them up. He gets bigger volume, and you see how this works. He just keeps doing this and gets bigger and bigger and bigger until ultimately his firm controls 85 to 90% of the market. It was huge. It is sort of an icon of how, in a completely unrestricted environment, given the institutional and technological situation of the time, monopoly power could be created. Monopoly is not forever, ever. Relative decline of Standard Oil. How did this happen? It happened mainly because of political activity. It happened mainly through legal changes. First, something called the Interstate Commerce Act. Why did this happen? It happened because of political pressure. It happened because people were outraged. It happened because people were losing their jobs, losing their farms, losing their homes. And so they lobbied, they struck, they rioted. Yes, they rioted. They did all kinds of things. And then ultimately Congress responded by saying, look, pipelines are a common carrier. So what? That means that if you own a pipeline, you can't keep somebody else out. That's what Rockefeller would do. He said, well, it's my pipeline. Hey, you want to do it with me, you have to take my terms because, hey, it's private property. I can do what I want. And then the Congress said, no, you can't do that. This is a common carrier. You have to let anybody use this kind of thing. Then, in 1890, at the height of the populist movement in the United States, which was centered in the West and the Great Plains, also in the South to some extent, there's a thing passed called the Sherman Antitrust Act, which broke up big monopolies. It basically is the source, the ultimate source of antitrust legislation in the United States. And the Sherman Antitrust Act then led to the breakup of Standard Oil. That's sort of breaking it up directly, but then there's the external cartel problem. High price, and there is increased discovery outside of Standard Oil's area, which was concentrated in Ohio and Pennsylvania, which is where Rockefeller starts and where most of the oil was first discovered. Oil was first discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1858. So that's his core area, but then over time, guess what? Oil gets found somewhere else. Question?
How did oil get discovered? What were they looking for to find it?
They were just poking around looking for a substitute for whale oil. Because we had killed off all the whales. Whales were being used for lighting, and so they needed something else. And they were just digging around. They said, you know what, we can burn this stuff. It's seeping out of the ground. Let's go drill. And so they found it. Standard Oil is declared a monopoly and broken up in 1911. So it ceases to exist as one company. But what happens next? It becomes a whole bunch of other companies. Like who? Well, like Standard Oil of New York, which later becomes Exxon, which has this territory. There's a thing called Atlantic. It used to be called Atlantic Richfield. Here's Standard Oil of New Jersey in here, which becomes Exxon. Standard Oil of New York later becomes Mobil Oil Company. And notice out here, Standard Oil of California. Who's that? Chevron. That's the origins of Chevron also are part of this whole situation. So, simple story. Oil's discovered. It's highly competitive. But one business entrepreneur creates monopoly power, not through crude oil, not even through economies of scale and refining, but by getting monopoly power in the transportation sector. That allows him then to drive his competitors out of business, establish as close to a monopoly as has ever existed in the oil business, and that is then eroded by two forces. The main one is institutional change in the U.S., driven by politics, and the second is discovery of oil in the Southwest. Big increase in the share of oil in the U.S. accounted for by Texas. And this then means that institutions in Texas will begin to play a role. Now, in terms of thinking about the history of the oil business, there is a very obscure institution called the Texas Railroad Commission. There's its logo. That's a Texas oil well. And here's the man who created it. This requires a little aside. His name was James Hogg, H-O-G-G. Yes, I'm not making up his name. That really was his name. James Hogg, he was the governor of Texas. He has several claims to fame. One is the Texas Railroad Commission, about which more momentarily. Two other claims, he had a daughter whom, in his wisdom, he named Ima. Now, there's a story that there was a second sister named Ura, and that's actually not true. That actually wasn't true, but Ima was real. The second thing that he is famous for is a famous remark about foreign languages, a foreign language requirement at the University of Texas, Austin, which at that time was the only University of Texas. And he opposed having a foreign language requirement because he said, and I quote, "If the English language was good enough for Jesus Christ, it ought to be good enough for the citizens of Texas." I'm not making it. We Texans know this. What was the Texas Railroad Commission? Well, it was actually the result, the product of a populist struggle against the railroads. The railroads had considerable monopoly power, and farmers at least believed they did, and farmers really didn't like them. And so farmers organized themselves and lobbied and fought, and so they got various regulations, and they created, in Texas, a thing called the Texas Railroad Commission. It was established in 1891, right around the time of the
the breakup of Standard Oil, heyday of the populist activity. And it begins regulating the Texas oil business in the 1930s. And we'll see this plays a big role. How did this basically work? Okay. Basically, the idea is that they say, well, look, because we regulate railroads, we can regulate how many cars carrying oil can move between one place and another. So you can see pretty quickly by just looking at the structure of production, that can roll back to control over output, and ultimately the Texas Railroad Commission would be dictating how much each well in the state could produce. It creates a kind of public market power in the hands of this particular organization. In the 1930s, this was very important. Because what happens to the price of oil in the 1930s? Well, two things. It's conjunctural. On the supply side, in the late 1920s and early 30s, large deposits of oil are found in Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. Big deposits. And then, so the supply curve shifts out. But then at the same time, there's the Great Depression, and incomes collapse. So the demand curve shifts back. And so the price collapses. This isn't good if you're an oil producer. You got a price collapse from $1.30 a barrel to less than a quarter a barrel in percentage terms. And remember, dollars are worth way more back then, and people are much poorer. And so that's a huge decline in price. And so the response was to regulate supply. This was the initial response of the Roosevelt administration with the National Recovery Act in the early 1933 and 34, and it was also the response at the state level in Texas, because the producers are saying, whoa, the price at the bottom has fallen out of our market, do something. Austin, that's the capital of the state. Do something, Austin. You've got to do it. Okay, Railroad Commission says, we will do this. We will start to do it. So they created this formula to reduce supply, and because it's a state government, and because this procedure was ratified in the courts, that they could enforce it. They, in short, have cartelization by government regulation. Texas Railroad basically decided how much each oil well in the biggest producing state could produce in a given month. So that's the kind of market power. They did this by setting first a target for Texas as a whole. How did they set that target? In close consultation with local oil folks, looking at the market as a whole, knowing that they weren't the only producer, but knowing that their production would have an impact on price, which is exactly, on a much larger scale, what OPEC has learned how to do. Okay? Looking at their output, they're not a monopolist, but they have some market power, so you look at how much your supply decision is going to affect price, then you make the decision, and then you enforce it on all the producers. Okay? That last part is a little more complicated in a case of self-status. Then, that's just Texas. How do you get that for the whole country? You pass legislation in Washington which in effect generalizes this. This so-called Hot Oil Act, Connolly was the governor of Texas, and they got an act that said, if you move oil across state lines that doesn't conform with these restrictive practices, then you're basically smuggling, you're a crook, and so we won't do this, and then you get tacit cooperation among the people in Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, and you set the stage for a high degree of price stability inside the United States. Okay? So, first foundation of price stability is this cartelization within the U.S. by government regulation. The NRA, by the way, this thing was stops in 35 because the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional in that year. So we have this age of pretty stable prices, right? Here's way back to the early 30s, right? Prices come way down, but then pretty stable for a long time. One component, U.S. domestic developments. Second component, the international business. So now we need to talk about the early history of the international oil business. First point. Many fewer producers. Many fewer. Nothing like the situation in Texas, etc. Standard Oil was a monopolist. They were the only oil producer internationally until 1884. But oil was discovered in the Russian Empire, specifically in the Caspian, in what is now the country of Azerbaijan. And this created a duopoly, two sellers, the Russians and Standard Oil. Then in Indonesia, which at the time was a colony of the Dutch, it's also found, and Royal Dutch Shell has its origins there. Why Royal? Well, Dutch is clear enough because it originates there. But the Dutch have long had very close relations with the British, particularly commercial relations, and they needed a bit more capital, they needed a bit more clout, and consequently it was a joint British and Dutch company whose headquarters to this day are a giant building on the Thames in the center of London. Standard Oil set what economists call an umbrella price. Sort of said, well, we're the big guys, so we set a basic price, and we know that other people will be underneath us trying to compete with us, but so long as they're not too far underneath us, we don't get too upset. We need to talk about what happened in the global market before World War II. A lot of things happened that Americans don't know much about, but which lots of people in the region have never forgotten about, and this affects what goes on. Relatively little crude was moving in international trade for pretty obvious reasons. Once the international economy tanks, and it wasn't so strong in the 1920s even, that's going to be one of the forces. And the trade was not in crude, it was mostly in refined products. Who were the producers? We were about half of total production in the early 20th century. The Russians, as we've already noted, start up, but then the Bolshevik Revolution happens and they disappear from the international oil business until the 1960s, when they'll be back. And it will matter that they return to the dynamics of cash and control. Indonesia, Latin America, particularly Venezuela, also Mexico, although again, Mexico, as a result of first the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920, and second, the nationalization of the Mexican oil industry under President Cardenas, then leads to sort of their relative isolation from the international market, and last but hardly least, our main area of concern. Now, we need to just review a little bit and talk a little bit more about the early history of oil in the Middle East. It starts with Winston Churchill. It starts, as I mentioned before, with Sir Winston Churchill, then the Lord of the Admiralty, read Secretary of the Navy in American jargon, when the British Navy switches over from coal ships to oil ships. And so, how do you get your hands on this stuff? You try to get it some places. Where is it first commercially discovered in the Middle East? In Iran. And this will matter a lot. Here's Mr. Knox Darcy, an Englishman. He gets a concession. For 60 years, what's a concession? It means that the Shah of Iran gave him exclusive monopoly rights to search for oil in the area of his control, and if he found oil, to produce it. In other words, it's a grant of monopoly power in oil within a nation state. Now, why would you do this? And notice how long it is. 60 years, that's a long time. Why would you do this? Because you're short of cash. Because, as we'll see, those problems of state formation will be very acute for you. And you have lots of problems. So you need cash up front and now, because your ability to get other forms of tax revenue will be very difficult. So here again, notice the way that whole business about the history of state formation is going to play in and interlock with the history of the oil business in helping us understand the dynamics. This guy, though, was a high roller, a big gambler. He gets almost bankrupt, so he sold his interest to an oil company based in Burma, that is in the British Indian Empire. And they strike oil, shown in this photograph of the time, in southwest, it was called Persia at the time, in Masjid-i-Sulaiman. And Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed. That is to say, this is the origin of BP, of British Petroleum. This is where BP comes from. BP comes from British in Iran. That's its origins. And we will see that will be very important in talking about developments in the 1950s. So, from the beginning, from the very beginning of the international oil business in the Middle East, there is conflict between the local state and the oil companies. There is a conflict over cash and control, which so far we've been talking about just as a kind of business or economic phenomenon, but because sovereign states are involved, it inevitably is intertwined with issues of imperialism, with nationalism, with state formation, and so we'll have to tell those stories together. How did this work? After all, there's a concession. Okay, we know what the company gets. The company gets exclusive rights to explore for oil, and if they find it, to produce it and sell it. That's a big deal, because rents then, as always, were large. This is a very valuable commodity. What does the country get? Well, the country gets some revenue. How is the revenue calculated? This will become a major source of contention throughout the early history of the oil business until 1974. There was a phenomenon called government royalties. Now, we still have the concept of royalties in economics, right? I mean, typically it comes from some asset that you happen to own. It's typical, for example, in copyrights. If you write a book, then somebody publishes your book, and the publisher has costs, and they have to sell this book, and there are revenues that come back, and they give the author something. They're called royalty fees. Or if you invent a new kind of software, you have a copyright on that. Again, somebody has to market and develop it, but then they pay you something called royalties. This was essentially the way the oil business was treated at the time. How, though, do we calculate these royalties? In Iran, at the beginning, that 16% of net income went to the country, went to Iran. So what does this mean? We have the royalty, we have the revenue, price times quantity. Quantity is the decision, sole decision of the company, remember, right? Because the company has the right to make that decision. Control, in that sense, adheres exclusively to the company. All right? The price, well, that's the international market. That depends on what the market will bear and what's going on in terms of cartels and so on. That's revenue, and then you subtract costs. But what are costs? Who knows what costs are? Then that determines total profits, and of that profit so calculated, Iran got 16%. Now, problem, the government couldn't see the books about costs. Do you think the Iranians thought this was fair? Well, no, actually, they didn't. And they will have a lot of conflict about this. Looking down the road, in the case of Iran, there are going to be continued arguments about how vigorously the government, vigorously the company, that should read that in this print, how vigorously the company looks for oil. Notice, a potential source of conflict of interest. If you're a country just receiving royalties, you always want sales to rise. Right? You want this to happen. But if you're a company and you're part of a cartel, you're taking a somewhat longer view. So there may be all kinds, you may not want to look for more oil. You may think, we don't want so much of this stuff right now, and that's going to be a source of conflict. In 1933, British Petroleum, throughout, by the way, footnote, throughout, I'm going to call companies by their current names. It wasn't called BP in 1933. It was called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. But we're just, to keep it simple, I'm going to call it BP. They agreed to reduction of their area of concession. One source of conflict always will be, what's the area of concession? Starts off, in the case of BP, being the whole country. But if the government of the country thinks this company is dragging its feet, what's in their interest? What's in their interest is to restrict that area so another area is now available so they can offer it to competitors who they think, well, maybe these guys will look for oil a little more. Particularly if those guys aren't members of the cartel. Because remember, only the oligopolist at the core of the diagram has an interest in holding a high price. Little guys don't care. They take the prices given. This dynamic, we'll see, will be big in the 1950s and 60s, leading to the erosion of the cartel and ultimately its replacement by OPEC. The Iranians also want more information, and they want representation on the board of directors, and they get it, but not, of course, yet controlling share of on the board of directors. Royalties then got changed in 1933. They changed from this percentage of profits to a fixed amount of money per ton, was the way it was calculated then. Think of it per barrel today. And what difference does this mean? It totally severs government revenue from market development. The governments have every incentive to have output go up because their money is simply a fraction of total output. It's a certain amount of money per amount of output. They're thinking of themselves as a competitor. They just want to sell as much as they can. But the oil companies don't necessarily want to do that. So they will not agree. And so they will have conflict. And so they will fight about things. And this will be a big deal. Seeds of future conflict get sold here. Companies had exclusive development rights over very large areas for long periods of time, during which the companies were exempt from all taxation in that country. And there were other issues: royalties, accounting procedures, arbitration. I mean, suppose the country and the government get into a dispute, which happens all the time. Well, who gets to decide? Does it get decided in the courts in London, which is what BP insisted on? You can imagine that the Iranians are not very impressed and don't really think that they're going to get such a fair deal. Okay? And then last but not least, what happens to the natural gas, which, as we've seen, typically lies on top of the oil dome geologically. And so what happens? You just burn it off, flare it, which is what was typically done. Or, as countries increasingly wanted to have happen, they said, look, this is a potential source of revenue. How about we do something with this? How about we market it? And so there's conflict over this. So there is there are plenty of sources of conflict between the companies and the governments. Right? And this, then, will be a big deal. So that's the case of Iran, and we will see this more than once. What about Iraq? Where did oil come from in Iraq? How does it get started? The first joint venture, we mentioned this institutional innovation of a joint venture. The first joint venture in history was a thing called the Turkish Petroleum Company. Remember, in 1912, Iraq was still part of the Ottoman Empire, and so it's called the Turkish Petroleum Company. This company seeks a concession from the Ottoman government, and we now know what a concession is. And it was invented by this Armenian entrepreneur, a man named Kalous Gulbenkian, and he creates these kinds of shares. He gets 5%. He's just an individual, a very rich individual, a very smart businessman, but he knows, no way, I've got to have big players here. And so he gets the UK government, which owns a dominant share in British Petroleum, Shell Oil, and the Germans, right, who are very friendly with the Ottoman Empire. So he creates this first joint venture. They start to explore, but, they only formed this in 1912. 2 years later, World War I starts, and it stops. Then, World War I ends. We get the mandate. We get the British taking over Iraq. And what happens? The United States says, well, wait a minute. Our oil companies need to come in here. We have this principle called the open door principle, meaning anybody gets to do business who's not a national in that country, then any other foreign national should be allowed to do business. Let us in. And the British said, well, you know, we won the war, so we'll just take the Germans' share, and we for political reasons, we want to mollify the French. We'll transfer to the French. This becomes a big issue at a big conference. It took several years. So here's another thing to notice, and we'll see this again a number of times. There's a kind of tension between the rising power, remember the lecture about international state systems, the rising power of the U.S. and the relative declining power of the European colonial states over the oil business. Now, they agree on a number of things. They were very happy. They want it all to be in the hands of private enterprise. They want the companies to be the ones doing it. But the American government was not then or now in the business of enriching foreign companies. And so it's looking out for the interests of American companies and using that in this. So it took several years to negotiate the entry of these big companies in the U.S. into the Turkish Petroleum Company. So notice, way back when, Exxon and Mobil had an interest in Iraqi oil. Interesting to note, just like Harry Truman said, there is nothing new under the sun except for the history that we don't know. They changed the name, of course. These things are like, you know, sort of like constantly morphing names. Iraq Petroleum Company, what did it look like? Well, BP had roughly a quarter. Shell had another quarter. Total, what's this? Total. That's a French company, Total. They had this. Near East Petroleum, which was another kind of consortium of U.S. companies. And Gulbenkian round out the picture, and here they are signing it and setting up this this kind of thing. But just like in Iran, so in Iraq, seeds of conflict are sown. Like how? First, among the companies. You've got multiple fissures, multiple cracks, multiple conflicts. You've got these companies right here, Standard Oil, British Petroleum, and Shell. As we'll see, these are members of the interwar cartel. But the French and everybody else are outside the cartel. So there's tension there. This also group here has lots of crude. They're crude long. They don't need more of it. They have massive refining capacity. They don't need it. They have plenty of crude. They don't need this. They're not interested, therefore, in increased production. And so there's relatively little production, which means right from the beginning, the consortium fails to meet the terms of its contract with the government of Iraq, which, needless to say, is something that the government of Iraq notices and is not pleased about. Things like constructing pipelines. They drag their feet. They don't do it. Now, of course, the companies are not without arguments about why they're doing this. It's the 1930s. Things are bad. Business is bad. We don't need more oil. Whoa, we don't want to drive the price down. But from the country's point of view, the answer is we don't care. We want revenue, and we want it now, and we need it now, and we've got to get it, and you foreigners are standing in the way of our getting our fair share. So there's lots of conflict. So, we'll go over this in more detail about what's going on in Iraq at the time later. They renegotiate the concession. In Iraq, there were no significant exports of oil until 1938, something that the Iraqi elite has never forgotten about. They are not pleased with this, which leads to increasing hostility of the Iraqis towards the oil business and towards Western oil firms in particular, and this will matter a lot in the 1950s and into the 1960s. Okay. So, how to make a cartel? How do you do it? One way to do it is John D. Rockefeller's method. But internationally, something else happened. We already know what's going to happen. And there are two agreements that create the interwar cartels. They have names. They're called the Red Line Agreement and the As-Is Agreement, sometimes called the Akari Agreement, as we'll see when that took place. What was the Red Line Agreement? It was established after all this squabbling Remember, just because World War I ends in 1919, this doesn't mean that anything's settled, really. All that's settled is that the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires have disintegrated. But then there's lots of conflict and squabbling about what the final terms will be, and so there's all these negotiations and going on. Finally, in the middle of July, at the end of July of 1928, there's an agreement. All the parties in this Turkish petroleum company, now the Iraq Petroleum Company, agree that they will only go through the joint venture if they look for oil inside the, quote, former Ottoman Empire. Okay? That's the agreement. This is a cartel agreement. Right? It's an agreement that says we'll only go through this one structure where every player gets to look at the books of other players, and we act no longer as individual self-interested actors, therefore falling into a prisoner's dilemma situation, but rather we act in concert. So it's a cartel agreement. Where did the name come from? The name came from this map. Everybody was saying, well, that's all very well, but what are the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire? I mean, what do you really say? And Gulbenkian said, hey, I'm an Armenian, I know where it is. And he took out, on a big map, he took out a red pen and drew this line. That's where it came from. Now, notice some things about this. Notice one important thing. Notice this little glitch right there. Kuwait was not part of it. One. Notice two, Iran was not part of it. That makes sense. British Petroleum already had monopoly power in Iran. They're the sole concessionaire in Iran. No way they're going to give that up. Right? And it's all about exploring and finding new stuff. And notice that this red line agreement includes a country that was just barely in the process of formation at the time, called the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where there is no oil. Nobody knows there's oil there. And we will see this will play a role as well. So that's the first cartel agreement, the red line agreement. Then there's an as-is agreement. Okay? There's a price war in India between two different sources of oil, Standard Oil and a subsidiary of Shell, getting into a price war. Companies worry about price wars. Big companies don't like price wars so much. They're afraid new discoveries will drive the price lower. We need a deal. They met at a castle in Auchnacarry, Scotland, owned by Sir Henry Dieterding. I'll show pictures of him later, probably next time, who was the chairman of the board of British Petroleum. And they got together, Standard Oil and BP and Shell, they all got together to form an agreement. This is designed, he was the chairman of Shell. They got together to limit competition and support prices of high-cost American producers. Then already, American producers had higher costs than did producers elsewhere, and they set up a formula to divide the market. What were the terms? They accept the current division of the market. Any market is to be supplied by its nearest source. You calculate, they had a formula for calculating prices. So everybody knew what everybody's price was, and they could talk to each other. And they were going to get together regularly to manage the agreement, which is necessary in business. There's the castle in Scotland where they met. As one analyst said, they got together to shoot grouse, but also to shoot customers because from producing countries. Anyway, they invited them, and they did this. So what? Last slide. Consequences are huge. It shuts down worldwide capacity by up to a third. So notice, do you think cartels of multinational companies are good for the countries? Answer, no. And they know it, and they don't like it, and they will seek to do something about it. It slows down the development of Middle Eastern oil production, a fact which is, to put it mildly, not lost on Iraqis and Iranians. By 1939, the Middle East, which as we've seen today is huge in the international oil business, was only 5% of global production. This, though, accelerates production in the U.S. and Canada, and certainly sows the seeds of lots of antagonism. Have a good weekend. We'll continue this.